I prepared a little project. You find a link to the GitHub repository with all those examples attached to the video. And here we can walk through all those important changes. And let's start with a basic app, with basic app v2. Here, I'm creating a basic Vue app with Vue version 2. Creating my Vue instance, having some data, having a method to change that data, and having a component with a template, which basically has a button where I emit a custom event. That's what I'm doing here. And if we view this application by simply opening this HTML file in the browser, this is what we see, and when we click the button, this works. Now this is Vue 2, and this is what you probably know. With Vue 3, a couple of things change here. To be precise, I'll now cover these first 3 changes which I outlined here, because all these changes affect what we see here. So let's go to basic app v3. There, we first of all have to make sure we import the latest version of Vue. And for that, I currently have to add at next year, since at the time I'm recording this, Vue 3 is in release candidate phase and not really finally released yet. In the future, of course, this default CDN link will automatically pull in Vue 3. And I will update this repository such that all the CDN links are correct all the time. So here I'm now importing Vue 3 by adding this. And with that added here, we'll see that if I now open this index.html file in the browser, this fails. Now we clearly don't see the message anymore, because this base syntax here changed a little bit with Vue 3. Here in app.js in the v3 folder, I got the Vue 2 syntax, but this will not work anymore. Instead, to create a Vue app, we now no longer instantiate the Vue constructor function here. Instead, on Vue, we call createApp. That's a new method that was added with Vue 3. Now to this createApp method, we now need to pass our app config object, and here we can pretty much copy the object we used in Vue 2 as well. But there are 2 other changes you should be aware of. The L property doesn't work anymore. Instead, we now mount our app to the DOM by calling mount on the created app object, so on the result of createApp. And to mount, we pass that CSS selector, which we previously had in L. And we can get rid of new Vue now. That's the first change. In addition, though, I mentioned that the data option also changed and now always needs to be a method. Now in Vue 2, both was allowed. You could have just an object and you could have a method, though a method was recommended in Vue 2 as well, especially if you worked with multiple components and so on, then you needed a method. Well, now with Vue 3, data always needs to be a method, so we simply should turn data into a method, which then returns our data object. So that's the only change we need to make here. Besides that, it works as before. And for example, methods, computed and watch, those things all work as you learn it. Nothing needs to change there. And with that, we already covered the first 2 changes here. Now the third change, which we should be aware of, also affects this demo app I prepared. Components, directives, third-party modules, all those things are now registered on the app instead of the global Vue object. So calling Vue.component, that's not how this works anymore. Instead, createApp creates an app, and we can store this in a constant. And then on this app, we can call mount, for example. Now, it's also on this app that we have to call component, directive, and use to use third-party modules. We'll see use in action later with the router and Vuex. So here, we can call component, and then pass this component code, which we also passed to the component method before, so these 2 arguments, to this component method here. So it works as before, but now it's on the app instead of the global Vue object. So with that, we get rid of this line here as well. With that, however, if I save all of that, and I reload, we got our message back, we got the button, and it works. Now, one minor change, which I didn't highlight on the slide, if you have a component that emits a custom method, like here, this component, it emits update, there also is a new option you can pass to this view instance config object here, and that's the emits option. It's basically the counterpart to props, you could say. With props, you specify all the props a component receives, and that was already the case with view 2. With emits, you now can and should also specify the custom events a component emits. It's technically not required, but it makes your component easier to understand. Now I can immediately see which custom event will be emitted somewhere in this component. It's a minor change, but also something to be aware of. And with that, we covered these first 3 changes you should know. Now the 4th change is related to transitions. There, a CSS class name changed. I also prepared an example for that. The transitions folders here. Let's start with transitions v2. If we open that in the browser, we got this button, and with that we can toggle the box here, which has a transition attached to it. This transition works simply because I'm wrapping the box with the built-in transition component and then adding my transition CSS classes down there in the CSS file. And this all worked with view 2, of course, because that's a view 2 example here. Now with view 3, this changes. If I make sure that I import view 3 here in the v3 folder, this example, if I load the v3 example, breaks. Now it breaks because we need to create the app differently. So let's quickly do that. View create app, instead of L, call mount here. And then also make sure data is a method. That's what we just learned. I just wanted to practice it here again. But that's a simple change, of course. With that, we create the app properly. And hence, if we reload, now this works. But you'll notice that the remove animation works, but the enter animation does not work. Because a CSS class name changed. The -enter class is now -enter -from, basically to be in line with the other class names, because we had -enter -active and -enter -to already. Now we also have -enter -from for the starting class instead of just -enter. And it's the same for leaving. This here should be -leave -from instead of just -leave. So a simple renaming of the class names is enough here, and once we do that, save everything. Now we got the animations back in view 3 as well. So that were transitions. We also got changes when we're using the view router. So let's see what changed there. For that, I also prepared 2 projects. Here's the view 2 version, here's the view 3 version. And here I used the view CLI to create projects, so it's no longer just an index.html file. Therefore, I'll navigate in router v2, run npm install, and then npm run serve, and this will install all the dependencies and then also bring up the development server for the view 2 version of this app here. Once you load the app, this is what you should see on the screen. We got 2 routes and we can switch between them, and we got a nice animation. Now, how is this built? I simply have my router set up in main.js by using view router, which is imported from view router, and by adding the router here to the global view instance, registering all the routes, setting mode to history, and we have the animation because the router view is wrapped with this transition. This is how it works in view 2. That's what you also learned in my course. If we go to the v3 version and also install everything there and start the development server, we'll see a difference. To be precise, initially we'll not see anything because I haven't added routing there yet. In the router v3 folder in main.js, we still have to add the router. For a good reason, because we now add it differently than before. Instead of importing view router from view router, I already installed the view router package here, that's why it's available. But instead of importing it like this, you import create router from view router. So you might see a theme here. We have create app from view to create an app. We have create router from the router to create a router. This is the new way of creating things in view 3. Now, once this is imported, we can create our router by calling create router. And we then use this router on our Vue app. So we can store the app in a constant and then call use on the app instead of on the global object. I mentioned before that we no longer do that. Instead, we call app use and use the router. This is how we add the router. But now we also need to configure the router. For that, we still pass a config object to create router. And now we can generally grab the configuration from Vue 2. So here I will grab the object, which was previously passed to Vue router, and paste this here into my create router function call. The routes configuration works just as you learned it. That's the good news. The mode, however, is set up differently. Instead of setting mode to history, you now need to set a history property in this config object and then create a history with another function. And here you typically import create web history and then simply execute this here. And the result of that is provided as a value to history. This is how you set up a default router using the HTML5 history mode for routing. With that, we just have to add the imports to welcome screen and users list, copy that from the v2 example into main.js in the v3 example, like this. And now if we reload, our routes work again. But you will notice that the transition is missing. We got no animation. I also have another small addition or note which I want to bring up first. In the header component, in the v3 project, there is the exact prop on router link. This prop was needed with Vue 2 and the router for Vue 2 to make sure that the home link wasn't marked as active when we were on users, because users also starts with a slash. With Vue 3 and the router for Vue 3, the router works differently internally and you no longer need this. It will automatically detect that home isn't active if you are on users. That's just a minor thing, but also worth knowing. More important than that, as I just mentioned, the transitions don't work anymore. The reason for that is that with Vue 3 and the router for Vue 3, you no longer may wrap router view with transition. Instead, it needs to be the other way around. Now, you need to pass transition into the router view. So the router view should wrap transition. This is related to changes made internally in the Vue router package. So router view in the end has a slot internally and needs this transition. The problem just is, transition of course should wrap the component that is swapped. And for that you can use another feature built into Vue. It's the dynamic component feature. You can use the built-in component. This tells Vue which component to render. Now the router determines which component should be rendered. And you can get access here in this slot in the end by using a feature called scoped slots. This feature already existed in Vue 2, and in my latest course update, the Vue 3 course update, which I added to my existing Vue course, I cover it in detail as well. You simply have a directive, the vslot directive, which you add to router view, and there you can then get access to special props which the router view exposes to you. You can now use these props here between the router view tags and bind the is prop on component, which component needs, to slotprops.component with a capital C. This prop here is exposed to you by the router and it holds the component that should be loaded for the selected route. This syntax certainly looks strange, but you only need it if you plan on using transitions with the router. Otherwise, you don't need it. With that, however, if I save this, now the transitions are back. Well, at least almost. We also need to adjust the transition names. As you learned a second ago, it's now enter-from and leave-from. And once we do that, now the transitions are fully fixed, and now we got nice animations for entering and leaving. You might notice that if you load the app, you also got an initial transition here, and that's also related to how the Vue router works internally. If you want to avoid this, you need to mount your app only once the router is fully initialized, and you can do this by going to main.js and calling router is ready, which gives you a promise which resolves once the router is ready. So if you mount your app in the function you pass to this then block, then you make sure the app is only mounted once the router is fully initialized. And this will ensure that you don't get this initial transition. So with this change made to main.js, now we can load without the initial transition, and we still got the transition for route changes. So as you can tell, we have a couple of changes to the Vue router, not to its core logic, but how you set it up and how you add transitions. And now, I guess you are aware of these changes. Great. Now the last change I want to cover here is a change to Vuex. The store is now created with create store there. I also got an example for that. You find it in the Vuex folders. And if we have a look at the Vue 2 version here, with npm install and npm run serve, you will see that it works just as you learned it. We create our Vuex store by instantiating new Vuex store and passing our store config to it. And then we add the store to the Vue app like this. With that, this is what we get. And here we got a basic store, which is managing this list of users here. Now with Vue Free, this works differently. If I dive into the Vue Free version of this and start this all, we first of all have to add Vuex again, just as we had to add the router before, because now we add it differently, as you might guess. Now we import create store from Vuex, again, to be in line with how we create things in Vue Free. Then we create our store by calling create store. And now the good news is, to create store, we pass exactly the same store config object as we did with Vue 2 and Vuex for Vue 2. So we can grab this object here, which holds the state and mutations and actions and getters, and we use that same object here for Vue Free. And that's important. How you work with Vuex and which features it has, that has all not changed. You still have actions, getters, mutations, state. You can use modules. That's the same. But now we create the store like this, and we then add it to our app by, you might also be guessing it already, by using it. So on our app, we simply use the store. And if we also had a router here, we would simply use the router as well. We don't have it here, but this is how you would use it. And with that, if you reload the Vue Free version, this also works without any other changes.